She believed her 3.2 million followers gave her the right to do whatever she wanted, wherever she wanted. However, when she crossed the line with a royal guard at Windsor Castle, she discovered that some boundaries should never be tested. Before we go on, please tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Also, subscribe to the channel if you respect the royal guards. The autumn morning at Windsor Castle was crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming across the ancient stone courtyard. Tourists moved in respectful clusters, their voices hushed as they absorbed the weight of nearly 1,000 years of British history. The imposing medieval walls seemed to watch over them, bearing witness to centuries of royal ceremonies, state occasions, and the quiet dignity of tradition. Standing at his post beside the Norman Gate, the royal guard remained perfectly motionless. His scarlet tunic was immaculate, each brass button polished to mirror brightness. The tall bearskin cap sat precisely positioned on his head, casting shadows across a face that might have been carved from stone. His rifle, an SA-80, was held at the perfect present arms position, the weapon's weight distributed with the unconscious ease of countless hours of drill. To the passing tourists he appeared almost ornamental, a living statue, part of the pageantry and spectacle that drew millions to Britain's royal residences each year. Children pointed and whispered, parents snapped respectful photographs from a distance, and elderly visitors paused to remember their own experiences of royal ceremonies from decades past. The guard's presence was both commanding and reassuring, a tangible link to Britain's unbroken chain of tradition. But among the respectful crowds that morning was someone who viewed the world through an entirely different lens. Madison Walsh, known to her 3.2 million Instagram followers as @Madison around the world, saw everything as potential content. The 24-year-old influencer had built her brand on pushing boundaries, creating controversy, and generating the kind of engagement that translated directly into sponsorship deals and brand partnerships. Madison strutted through the castle grounds with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Her outfit was carefully curated for maximum visual impact, a cropped designer jacket that cost more than most people's monthly salary, skin-tight leggings that showcased her gym-sculpted figure, and pristine white sneakers that had never seen a speck of dirt. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in loose waves, and her makeup was camera-ready despite the early hour. "This is going to be absolutely iconic," she announced to her videographer Danny, who followed behind her with professional-grade camera equipment. "My followers are going to die when they see me getting up close and personal with actual British royalty guards." Danny, a nervous 20-something who had been hired more for his desperation than his talent, shifted uncomfortably. "Madison, maybe we should just stick to the regular tourist areas? I mean, there are signs everywhere about not disturbing the guards." Madison's perfectly contoured face twisted into a dismissive smirk. "Danny, sweetie, those rules are for regular people. Do you see how many followers I have? Brands pay me 6 figures to wear their products. I've had dinner with A-list celebrities. These guards are basically just actors in costumes. They're here to look pretty for tourists like me." She pulled out her phone, its rose gold case catching the morning light, and began recording an Instagram story. "Good morning, beautiful humans. Madison here, coming to you live from Windsor Castle in England. I'm about to create some absolutely incredible content with one of these famous royal guards. You guys know I always deliver the most exclusive access." The notification sounds from her phone. Hearts, fire emojis, and comments from her devoted followers filled the air like digital applause. Madison thrived on this constant validation, this stream of attention that confirmed her importance in the world. Each like, each comment, each share was proof that she mattered, that she was special, that normal rules didn't apply to her. As she approached the guard's position, other tourists began to notice the commotion. A family from Japan bowed respectfully and moved aside, clearly uncomfortable with Madison's loud, attention-seeking behavior. An elderly British couple, The woman wearing a small collection of military medals on her coat watched with growing concern. "Excuse me, dear," the elderly woman called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen decades of proper protocol. "You might want to maintain a respectful distance. These guards are active duty soldiers, not entertainers." Madison barely glanced in her direction. "Thanks for the concern, but I've got this handled." She flipped her hair dismissively. "I work with security and military people all the time for my content. They love being in my videos. It's great exposure for them." The elderly woman's husband, whose own collection of service medals spoke of tours in the Falklands and Northern Ireland, stepped forward. "Young lady, with respect, you don't understand what you're dealing with. These men are professional soldiers, not props for social media." But Madison had already turned away, her attention fully focused on her prize. The royal guard stood motionless at his post, his eyes fixed straight ahead, seemingly oblivious to her approach. To Madison, this was perfect. She interpreted his stillness as weakness, his discipline as an inability to act. "This is going to be so good," she whispered to Danny, who was reluctantly following behind with his camera. "Look how stiff and robotic he is. My followers are going to eat this up." What Madison didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have comprehended in her shallow, social media-obsessed worldview, was that she was approaching not a ceremonial figure, but one of Britain's most elite warriors. The man standing guard was Sergeant First Class Michael Harrison of the Welsh Guards, a decorated veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan. His service record included the Military Cross for gallantry during the Battle of Marha, where he had single-handedly held a strategic position against insurgent attacks for over 6 hours, saving the lives of 12 wounded civilians. His hands, steady and sure on his rifle, had pulled wounded comrades from burning vehicles under enemy fire. His eyes, which now stared straight ahead with ceremonial discipline, had seen horrors that would break lesser men. But Harrison's true strength lay not in his combat experience, but in his absolute mastery of military protocol and discipline. He had been selected for the Royal Guard not just for his service record, but for his unshakable composure, his ability to maintain perfect military bearing under any circumstances, and his encyclopedic knowledge of royal protocol and British military history. The Royal Guards were not museum pieces or tourist attractions. They were active duty soldiers, each one a specialist in their field, each one capable of transitioning from ceremonial duties to combat operations at a moment's notice. Their rifles were not props. They were loaded weapons in the hands of trained killers who would defend the royal family and British interests with their lives if necessary. But Madison saw none of this complexity, none of this dangerous competence barely contained beneath the surface of ceremonial tradition. She saw only an opportunity for content, a chance to generate the kind of viral moment that would boost her follower count and impress her sponsors. "Okay, Danny, start recording," she commanded, smoothing her jacket and checking her appearance in her phone's camera. "I'm going to get right up next to him for the most epic selfie ever. My followers are going to absolutely lose their minds." She began her approach, her high-end sneakers clicking against the ancient stone courtyard. With each step, she violated centuries of protocol, ignored clearly posted signs, and dismissed the growing murmurs of concern from other tourists. "Here I go, beautiful humans," she narrated to her phone camera, her voice pitched to carry across the courtyard. "About to get up close and personal with a real live royal guard. This is the kind of exclusive content you can only get from Madison around the world." The elderly veteran and his wife exchanged worried glances. Other tourists began pulling out their phones, but not to support Madison's stunt. They were documenting what they increasingly realized might become a serious incident. "Someone should stop her," whispered a teenage girl to her mother. "The guard will handle it," her mother replied, though her voice carried uncertainty. "Surely he'll say something before she gets too close." But Sergeant Harrison remained perfectly still, his discipline absolute, his training complete. He was bound by strict protocol. Royal guards did not break their ceremonial bearing except in cases of direct threat to the monarchy, national security, or when specifically ordered to act by superior officers. Madison interpreted this stillness as permission, even encouragement. In her world, silence meant consent, and the absence of resistance meant approval. She had built her entire career on the assumption that her desires took precedence over other people's boundaries. "This is so cool," she gushed to her camera. "Look how dedicated he is to staying in character. This is going to make such amazing content." She was now within 10 feet of the guard, well inside the invisible perimeter that separated respectful observation from dangerous intrusion. The other tourists had formed a loose semicircle, watching with a mixture of fascination and horror as the situation escalated. Danny, still filming reluctantly, called out, "Madison, maybe that's close enough? I'm getting some great shots from here." "Don't be such a wimp, Danny," Madison snapped back, not taking her eyes off her target. "This guard is totally fine with it. Look, he's not even reacting. He probably loves the attention. When's the last time someone this famous wanted to feature him in content?" The elderly woman with the military medals tried one more time. "Miss, please reconsider. You're entering a restricted area. These soldiers have the authority to use force if necessary." Madison laughed, a sound sharp and brittle in the morning air. "Force? Look at him. He's like a statue. He couldn't hurt a fly even if he wanted to. These guys are basically just for show." This dismissive comment sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the crowd. Several British tourists looked genuinely offended, their faces flushing with indignation at Madison's casual disrespect for their military traditions. But Madison was beyond caring about other people's feelings. She was in full performance mode now, riding the high of attention and convinced of her own invincibility. She held up her phone, angling for the perfect selfie position that would capture both her face and the stoic guard behind her. "Okay, beautiful humans, here we go," she announced to her camera. "The moment you've all been waiting for, Madison and the Royal Guard, together at last." She stepped forward again, now close enough to touch the guard's immaculate uniform. The morning light caught the brass buttons on his tunic, the polished leather of his boots, the razor-sharp creases in his trousers. Every detail spoke of military precision, of standards maintained through generations of service, of a tradition that demanded respect. But Madison saw only a backdrop for her content. "Can you believe how still he is?" She marveled to her audience, both live and virtual. "It's like he's not even human. This is definitely going to be my most viral post ever." Behind the guard's motionless facade, Sergeant Harrison was acutely aware of every detail of the situation. His peripheral vision tracked Madison's movement, noted the position of her cameraman, catalogued the locations of all the tourists who had stopped to watch. His ears registered the growing tension in their voices, the concern of the veterans in the crowd, the excited chatter of Madison's fans who were watching via livestream. His training allowed him to assess threats with lightning speed and ruthless precision. Madison herself was not a physical danger. She was unarmed, clearly focused on social media rather than violence, and more interested in attention than harm. But her complete disregard for protocol, her invasion of his personal space, and her deliberate disruption of his ceremonial duties were rapidly approaching the threshold that would require action. Royal Guards operated under specific rules of engagement. They were authorized to use verbal commands to control situations, physical force to remove threats, and ultimately lethal force if the safety of the royal family or national security were at stake. But before any of those measures, they were expected to maintain their ceremonial composure and allow proper authorities to handle disruptions whenever possible. Harrison's radio crackled softly with chatter from the castle's security team, who were monitoring the situation and moving into position. But Madison was escalating faster than they could respond, and her complete obliviousness to the danger she was creating made the situation increasingly unpredictable. "I think I need to get even closer," Madison announced, studying her phone screen critically. "The lighting isn't quite right from this angle." She took another step forward, now close enough that her breath would have fogged the brass buttons on the guard's tunic, if not for the cool morning air. She was well within arm's reach, violating every principle of security and protocol that governed the Royal Guard's operations. "Perfect," she exclaimed, raising her phone for the ultimate selfie. "This angle is absolutely gorgeous. Danny, make sure you're getting all of this." But as she lifted her phone to take the photo, disaster struck. In her excitement and her complete focus on getting the perfect shot, Madison lost her balance slightly. Her designer sneaker caught on an uneven stone in the ancient courtyard, and she stumbled forward. Instinctively, she reached out to steady herself, and her hand landed squarely on Sergeant Harrison's chest, gripping the fabric of his ceremonial tunic. The effect was instantaneous and electric. The moment Madison's hand made contact with the guard's uniform, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Physical contact with a royal guard was not just discourteous, it was a potential security threat, a violation of protocol so serious that it demanded immediate and decisive response. Harrison's training took over with machine-like precision. In the space of a heartbeat, his mind processed the situation. Unauthorized physical contact, potential threat to ceremonial duties, clear violation of established boundaries, and the need for immediate de-escalation. His reaction was so swift and smooth that many of the watching tourists initially missed it. With movements honed by years of military training, Harrison shifted his weight and executed a perfect defensive maneuver. His free hand, the one not holding his rifle, moved in a quick, controlled arc that gently but firmly removed Madison's hand from his uniform while simultaneously creating distance between them. The movement was a textbook example of military precision, not aggressive, not violent, but absolutely decisive and effective. Madison found herself suddenly off balance again, this time stumbling backward as the guard's professional defensive technique left her with nothing to lean against. "What the—" Madison started to exclaim, her perfect influencer composure cracking for the first time that morning. But Harrison wasn't finished. Having established physical boundaries, he now deployed the second tool in his arsenal, his voice. "Step back," Harrison commanded, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. The words weren't shouted, but they carried the unmistakable authority of a combat veteran, the kind of command presence that had directed troops under enemy fire and maintained order in the chaos of warfare. The crowd fell instantly silent. Madison's phone, which she had been holding up for her selfie, tumbled from her suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered against the stone courtyard. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. For the first time since arriving at Windsor Castle, Madison found herself truly looking at the Royal Guard, not as a prop for her content, but as the formidable human being he actually was. Harrison's eyes, which had stared straight ahead with ceremonial discipline just moments before, now fixed on her with laser intensity. They were the eyes of a warrior, cold and assessing, missing nothing. "Ma'am," Harrison continued, his voice slightly softer but no less authoritative. "You are in violation of royal protocol and British military law. Step back behind the barrier immediately." The words hit Madison like a physical blow. For someone who had spent years surrounding herself with sycophants and yes-men, who had built her entire identity on the assumption that she was special and important, being addressed as a common rule-breaker was devastating. I was just taking a selfie," she stammered, her influencer confidence evaporating like morning mist. "I didn't mean any harm. I'm Madison Walsh. I have over 3 million followers." "Ma'am," Harrison interrupted, his tone making it clear that her social media status was irrelevant. "Your follower count does not supersede British law. You have made unauthorized physical contact with a member of His Majesty's Guard and disrupted official ceremonial duties. Step back now." The crowd began to murmur with approval. The elderly veterans nodded their satisfaction, finally seeing the young woman receive the correction she had so desperately needed. Other tourists pulled out their phones, but now they were recording Madison's humiliation rather than supporting her stunt. Danny, still holding his camera but clearly shaken by the sudden turn of events, whispered urgently, "Madison, come on, let's just go. This isn't worth it." But Madison's ego was too fragile, her sense of entitlement too deeply ingrained, to accept this public correction gracefully. Instead of apologizing and withdrawing, she doubled down on her behavior. "You can't talk to me like that!" she snapped, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that carried across the courtyard. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm a content creator. I work with major brands. I have millions of people watching me right now." She gestured wildly at her phone, which was still on the ground where it had fallen, its screen cracked from the impact. "This is going to be such bad publicity for you guys. My followers are going to hear about how rude and unprofessional you were to me." Harrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that suggested Madison had just made a serious error in judgment. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his military authority, "threatening a member of His Majesty's Guard is a criminal offense under the Protection of Royal Persons Act. You are creating a disturbance, disrupting official duties, and now engaging in intimidating behavior toward a soldier of the Crown." The legal terminology sent a visible shock through Madison's system. For the first time, she seemed to realize that this wasn't a game, that her actions might have real consequences that her follower count and brand partnerships couldn't protect her from. But instead of backing down, Madison's panic manifested as even more aggressive behavior. She had spent so many years having her way through tantrums and threats that she couldn't conceive of a situation where these tactics wouldn't work. "You're just trying to intimidate me," she accused, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I know my rights. I'm an American citizen. You can't do anything to me." She took a step forward again, back toward the guard, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I want to speak to your manager. I want to file a complaint. This is harassment." The watching crowd gasped audibly. Even the tourists who had been sympathetic to Madison's initial confusion now looked horrified at her escalating aggression toward the soldier. Several people began moving away, clearly uncomfortable with the increasingly volatile situation. Harrison, however, remained perfectly calm. This was exactly the kind of situation his training had prepared him for, an unstable individual making threats and refusing to comply with lawful orders. His years of combat experience had taught him to read people under stress, to predict when words would no longer be sufficient and action would be required. "Ma'am," he said one final time, his voice carrying the unmistakable note of a final warning. "This is your last opportunity to comply voluntarily. Step back behind the barriers and cease disrupting official ceremonies, or you will be subject to arrest under British military law." Madison's face flushed red with rage and embarrassment. The combination of being publicly corrected, having her authority questioned, and being treated like a common criminal was more than her inflated ego could handle. "Arrest?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the ancient castle walls. "You can't arrest me! I'm a social media influencer. I have lawyers. I'll sue everyone involved in this." She pulled out a second phone from her jacket pocket, a backup device that many influencers carried for precisely this kind of situation. "I'm going to live stream this whole thing. My followers are going to see how you're treating an innocent American tourist." She activated the live stream function and immediately began narrating to her audience, her voice high and frantic. "Beautiful humans, you are not going to believe what is happening to me right now. This crazy British soldier is threatening to arrest me just for taking a selfie. This is absolutely insane!" The livestream comments began flooding in immediately. But instead of the support Madison expected, The majority of her followers were expressing shock and disapproval at her behavior. Comments like, "Girl, just apologize and leave. You're being so disrespectful, and that guard is just doing his job," dominated the feed. But Madison was too deep in her narcissistic rage to notice. She held the phone up toward Harrison, as if the camera's presence would somehow shield her from consequences. "Look at him," she narrated to her audience. "He's just standing there trying to intimidate me. This is what happens when Americans try to create content in foreign countries. They try to shut us down." Harrison watched this display with the kind of professional detachment that came from years of dealing with unstable individuals in high-stress situations. He could see that Madison was spiraling, that her ego was preventing her from making the rational choice to de-escalate and withdraw. Behind Madison, Danny had stopped filming and was slowly backing away from the situation. Even in his desperation for work, he recognized that this had moved far beyond anything he wanted to be associated with professionally. "Madison," he called out quietly. "Seriously, we need to go. This is getting really bad." But Madison was beyond reason now. The combination of public humiliation, legal threats, and the realization that her usual tactics weren't working had pushed her into a state of pure panic-driven aggression. "I'm not going anywhere," she declared, both to Danny and to her live stream audience. "I have every right to be here. This is a public space. I'm going to stand right here until someone with actual authority comes to deal with this situation properly." She took another step toward Harrison, now close enough again that she was definitely within what military protocol would consider a threatening distance. Her phone was still held up, recording, and her free hand was gesticulating wildly as she continued her rant. "And another thing," she continued, her voice growing even shriller, "I want everyone to see how these so-called professional soldiers treat visitors. This is supposed to be a tourist destination, but they're being completely hostile and unwelcoming." Harrison had heard enough. Madison's repeated advances, her refusal to comply with lawful orders, her threatening behavior toward a member of the Royal Guard, and her continued disruption of official ceremonies had pushed the situation well beyond the point where verbal warnings would be sufficient. But what happened next was not what anyone in the crowd, least of all Madison, expected. Instead of calling for backup, instead of escalating to physical restraint, Harrison deployed the most devastating weapon in his arsenal, his encyclopedic knowledge of royal protocol and British military history. "Ma'am," Harrison began, his voice shifting from the clipped authority of military commands to the measured cadence of an Oxford lecturer. "Since you have chosen to make this a public spectacle and have repeatedly invoked your rights as a tourist, perhaps it would be educational for your audience to understand exactly what those rights are." The sudden change in his tone was so unexpected that Madison actually stopped talking, her mouth hanging open in surprise. Harrison continued, his words carrying easily across the now silent courtyard. "You are currently standing on the grounds of Windsor Castle, a working royal residence and active military installation. This is not, as you have claimed, a public space. It is Crown property, governed by specific laws and protocols that have been in place for nearly 1,000 years." Madison tried to interrupt, but Harrison's voice cut through her attempted response with scholarly precision. "The Royal Guards," Harrison continued, "are not, as you have suggested, ceremonial figures or tourist attractions. We are active duty soldiers of the British Army, specifically selected for our service records, our discipline, and our ability to protect the Crown and its interests under any circumstances." He paused, letting this information sink in, before continuing with devastating effectiveness. "I am Sergeant First Class Michael Harrison of the Welsh Guards, veteran of 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, recipient of the Military Cross for Gallantry under Fire, and currently assigned to the personal protection of His Majesty's family. My qualifications for this position include advanced training in close protection, crowd control, threat assessment, and—" he paused meaningfully, "dealing with unstable individuals who pose potential risks to royal security. The crowd was absolutely riveted. Even Madison's live-stream audience, visible as rapid-fire comments on her phone screen, had fallen into fascinated silence. Harrison wasn't finished. Your repeated attempts to make physical contact with me, despite multiple warnings, constitute assault under British law. Your threats regarding publicity and legal action constitute intimidation of a Crown servant. Your disruption of official ceremonies violates the Public Order Act of 1986, and your continued presence in a restricted area after being ordered to leave constitutes trespassing on Crown property. Madison's face had gone pale. For the first time since arriving at Windsor Castle, she was beginning to understand that she might be in serious legal trouble. But Harrison's masterclass in royal protocol was just beginning. Furthermore, he continued, his voice taking on the measured rhythm of someone reciting from memory, under the Protection of Royal Persons Act of 1994, any individual who behaves in a manner that could reasonably be interpreted as threatening to the security of royal premises is subject to immediate detention and questioning by authorized personnel. He gestured subtly toward the edges of the courtyard, where Madison now noticed that several castle security officers had appeared and were watching the situation with professional attention. Your insistence on recording this interaction, despite being warned that you are violating security protocols, could be interpreted as reconnaissance activity. Your repeated advances toward my position after being ordered to maintain distance could be interpreted as probing castle defenses, and your threats of legal and publicity retaliation could be interpreted as attempting to intimidate security personnel. Madison's phone began to shake in her hand. The live-stream comments were now a flood of viewers telling her to apologize, leave immediately, and stop making the situation worse. But Harrison wasn't done demonstrating the depth of his knowledge and the seriousness of Madison's situation. The British military, he continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had studied these matters extensively, operates under a different legal framework than civilian law enforcement. As an active duty soldier assigned to royal protection duties, I have the authority to detain individuals who pose potential threats, to use appropriate force to maintain security, and to turn detained individuals over to military police for processing. He paused, letting the full weight of military justice sink in. Military justice, unlike civilian courts, does not provide for bail on security-related charges. Individuals detained under the Protection of Royal Persons Act can be held for up to 28 days without charge while investigations are conducted. During that time, their electronic devices are subject to full forensic examination, their social media activities are thoroughly investigated, and their associations and travel patterns are scrutinized for potential security implications. Madison's second phone clattered to the ground beside her first one, both devices now forgotten as the full scope of her predicament became clear. Harrison continued his devastating lecture with the same calm precision he would have used to disassemble a rifle or plan a military operation. Given that you have identified yourself as a social media influencer with millions of followers, any security investigation would necessarily examine your content history, your audience demographics, your international travel patterns, and your potential connections to individuals or organizations that might have interest in royal security arrangements. The implications of this statement sent a visible shudder through Madison's frame. The idea of having her entire digital life scrutinized by military intelligence was clearly terrifying to someone whose career depended on carefully curated public image. Such investigations, Harrison noted with academic precision, typically result in individuals being placed on various security watch lists, regardless of whether charges are ultimately filed. These listings can affect future travel, employment opportunities, and international business activities for years or even decades. Madison's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she swayed on her feet. The elderly woman with the military medals, who had tried to warn her earlier, looked almost sympathetic now, as she watched the young woman finally understand the consequences of her actions. But Harrison's lesson wasn't complete. Having established the legal framework, he now moved to the historical context that gave weight to royal protocol. "These protocols," he explained, his voice taking on the reverent tone of someone discussing sacred traditions, "exist not because of arbitrary rules or ceremonial pageantry, but because they have been refined over centuries of actual threats to the crown. Every procedure, every boundary, every restriction has been written in blood, often literally." He gestured towards the ancient walls surrounding them. "This castle has withstood sieges, bombardments, and assassination attempts. These grounds have seen kings murdered, queens executed, and dynasties toppled. The security measures you have dismissed as outdated formality exist because history has proven, again and again, that the price of complacency is measured in royal blood." The historical weight of his words settled over the courtyard like a heavy blanket. Even tourists who had been casually observing the situation now stood in respectful silence, suddenly aware of the deeper significance of the traditions they had come to witness. Harrison's voice grew even more serious as he continued his historical lesson. "The Royal Guards were established not as a tourist attraction, but as the last line of defense for the monarchy. We are selected not for our appearance or our ability to stand still, but for our demonstrated courage under fire, our absolute loyalty to the crown, and our willingness to die before allowing harm to come to those under our protection." Madison was now visibly shaking, whether from cold, fear, or the realization of how badly she had misjudged the situation. "When you attempted to make physical contact with me," Harrison continued with clinical precision, "you were not simply bothering a ceremonial figure. You were testing the security perimeter around one of Britain's most important cultural and political institutions. In doing so, you triggered protocols that have been developed and refined through centuries of protecting the realm's most valuable assets." He paused, his eyes never leaving Madison's face before delivering his final historical observation. "Throughout British history, individuals who have shown disrespect for royal authority, who have attempted to breach security protocols, or who have demonstrated the kind of entitled disregard you have shown today, have found themselves facing the full weight of crown justice. That tradition continues today, not because we cling to the past, but because the principles underlying it remain as valid now as they were when this castle was built." The silence that followed Harrison's lecture was profound. Madison stood frozen, her face pale and her eyes wide with the realization of how completely she had misjudged the situation. Her earlier confidence, her assumption of special treatment, her dismissive attitude toward British traditions and military authority, all of it had crumbled under the weight of Harrison's demonstration of superior knowledge and moral authority. The tourists who had gathered to watch the spectacle were now looking at Madison with a mixture of pity and disapproval. Her own live-stream audience, visible in the rapid scroll of comments on her abandoned phones, were overwhelmingly critical of her behavior and supportive of the Guard's professional response. Even Danny, her cameraman, had moved to a respectful distance and was no longer filming. The professional in him recognized that Madison's brand had just suffered potentially irreparable damage, and he had no interest in being associated with the fallout. But Harrison wasn't quite finished. Having delivered his masterclass in royal protocol and military authority, he now prepared to demonstrate the final element of his professional competence: perfect discipline in the face of victory. "Ma'am," he said, his voice returning to the formal tone of military protocol, "you now have a clear understanding of your situation and your options. I am going to give you one final opportunity to resolve this matter with dignity." Madison nodded frantically, finally ready to listen and comply with whatever instructions she received. "You will step back behind the barriers," Harrison continued with military precision. "You will collect your devices. You will apologize to the tourists whose experience you have disrupted with your behavior, and then you will leave these premises immediately and permanently." He paused, letting the terms of her reprieve sink in. In exchange for your immediate and permanent departure, I will not activate the security protocols that would result in your detention and investigation. Your devices will not be confiscated and examined. Your visa status will not be flagged for review, and this incident will not be reported to the appropriate authorities. The relief that washed over Madison's face was visible from across the courtyard. The realization that she was being offered a way out of what could have been a career-ending legal nightmare was almost overwhelming. However, Harrison added, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality, this offer is contingent on your immediate compliance and your permanent departure from these premises. Any hesitation, any attempt to negotiate, any further disruption of any kind will result in the full activation of security protocols and your immediate detention. Madison nodded so vigorously that her carefully styled hair came loose from its perfect waves. Yes, absolutely, I understand. I'm so sorry. I'll leave right away. She stumbled toward her fallen phones, her hands shaking as she retrieved them from the stone courtyard. Both devices had cracked screens from their falls, but they were still functional. As she picked up the second phone, she could see that her live stream was still running, and the comments were a mixture of relief that she was finally complying and criticism of her entire approach to the situation. I'm really sorry, she stammered to the crowd of tourists, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to disturb anyone's visit. I was just trying to create content, but I realize now that I was completely wrong about everything. The elderly woman with the military medals nodded approvingly. We all make mistakes, dear. The important thing is learning from them. Madison managed a weak smile at this small gesture of forgiveness, then turned back toward Harrison for what she clearly hoped would be final acknowledgement of her compliance. But Harrison had already returned to his position. With the fluid precision of a soldier returning to duty, he had resumed his ceremonial stance, rifle at present arms, eyes fixed straight ahead, posture perfect and motionless. To a casual observer, it would appear as though nothing had happened at all. The transformation was so complete and so immediate that several tourists gasped in amazement. One moment Harrison had been delivering a commanding lecture on military protocol and royal history. The next, he was once again the perfect ceremonial figure, as still and dignified as a statue. Madison stared at him for a moment, clearly struggling to reconcile the two versions of the same man she had encountered. The silent, motionless guard who had initially seemed so harmless was the same person who had just delivered the most thorough and devastating correction of her life. Danny approached her cautiously, clearly ready to retreat if she showed any signs of renewed aggression. Madison, we should really go now, before anything else happens. Madison nodded numbly, still staring at Harrison as if she couldn't quite believe what had just occurred. Yeah, okay, let's go. As she turned to leave, walking on unsteady legs toward the castle exit, the full weight of what had just happened began to settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Every step took her further from the scene of her humiliation, but also deeper into the realization of how completely she had misunderstood the world she had tried to exploit. The other tourists parted respectfully as she passed, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to disapproving. A few were still recording with their phones, and Madison realized with growing horror that her public breakdown was probably already spreading across multiple social media platforms. The very fame she had tried to leverage had now become the vehicle for her most embarrassing moment. Danny walked beside her in uncomfortable silence, his camera equipment packed away and his face carefully neutral. As they approached the castle gates, he finally spoke in a low voice. Madison, that was really intense back there. Maybe we should call it a day and head back to London. Madison didn't respond immediately. She was scrolling through the comments on her live stream, which was still running, and the feedback was overwhelmingly negative. Her followers, who usually praised her boldness, and supported her boundary-pushing content were instead criticizing her behavior and expressing embarrassment at being associated with her brand. "Madison Walsh is so disrespectful," read one comment. "That guard was just doing his job, and she acted like such an entitled brat. Girl needs to learn some respect for other countries' traditions," read another. "This is why people hate American tourists." "Did she really think her follower count would protect her from the law?" asked a third. "That guard schooled her so hard. She got exactly what she deserved." The comments kept coming, each one a small dagger to Madison's carefully constructed self-image. For someone who had built her entire identity on social media validation, this level of criticism was devastating. But perhaps even more troubling were the comments from her sponsors and brand partners, who were beginning to express concern about being associated with her content. Several had already posted messages suggesting they might need to reevaluate their partnership with her brand. As they passed through the castle gates and into the public street beyond, Madison finally ended her live stream and turned off her phone. The sudden silence felt oppressive after hours of constant notification sounds and digital chatter. "I need to sit down," she said quietly, spotting a small cafe across from the castle entrance. Danny followed her to an outdoor table where Madison collapsed into a chair and buried her face in her hands. For the first time since he had started working for her, Danny saw her without the mask of confident superiority that she usually wore. "I completely screwed this up," she whispered, her voice muffled by her hands. "That guard, he knew everything. History, law, protocol, and I just assumed he was some kind of decoration." Danny nodded cautiously. "He was pretty impressive. I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that." Madison looked up. Her perfect makeup now smeared with tears, she didn't even realize she had been crying. "My followers hate me, Danny. My sponsors are probably going to drop me. And we got it all on video." She gestured toward his camera bag with a bitter laugh. "All that footage of me making a complete fool of myself. Content that's going to destroy my career instead of boosting it." Danny shifted uncomfortably. "Madison, maybe this could actually be good for you. Like if you were to post an apology video, acknowledge what you learned. Show that you can grow from mistakes." Madison stared at him as if he had suggested she give up social media entirely. "An apology video? Do you know what that would do to my brand? I built my following on being bold, on not backing down, on showing my audience that they can get whatever they want if they're confident enough. But," Danny pressed gently, "what if your brand could be about learning and growing instead? About traveling respectfully and actually understanding the places you visit?" The suggestion hung in the air between them as Madison considered it. For someone who had never really reflected on the deeper meaning of her content or the impact of her behavior, the idea of fundamental change was almost incomprehensible. Meanwhile, back at Windsor Castle, the aftermath of the confrontation was unfolding in ways that Madison couldn't have imagined. Sergeant Harrison had resumed his ceremonial duties without missing a beat, but the tourists who had witnessed his masterful handling of the situation were still buzzing with excitement and admiration. The elderly woman with the military medals approached his position, though maintaining a respectful distance, and offered a small salute. "Well done, Sergeant," she said quietly. "My husband and I served for 30 years, and we've never seen a situation handled with such professionalism and dignity." Other tourists began to follow suit, approaching the barrier around Harrison's position to express their appreciation. A family from Canada thanked him for defending the dignity of royal traditions. A group of students from a London university asked respectful questions about the history he had referenced. Even some of Madison's younger followers, who had initially supported her stunt, began to express newfound respect for the guards and their role. Word of the incident spread quickly through the castle's security network, and senior officers began receiving reports about the impressive way one of their guards had handled a potentially serious situation without escalating to physical force or creating an international incident. Within hours, video footage of Harrison's response, captured by multiple tourists and Madison's own live stream, began circulating on social media platforms. But instead of going viral as content that mocked or undermined the Royal Guards, it spread as a powerful example of professionalism, knowledge, and dignity under pressure. The hashtag #RespectTheGuard began trending on multiple platforms, with users sharing the video alongside comments praising Harrison's handling of the situation and criticizing Madison's disrespectful behavior. Military history enthusiasts began breaking down Harrison's lecture, fact-checking his statements about royal protocol and British military tradition. Every detail he had cited was confirmed as accurate, leading to even greater appreciation for his expertise and preparation. Educational content creators began using the incident as a case study in cultural sensitivity and the importance of understanding local customs and laws when traveling internationally. But perhaps most significantly, the incident began to change how people thought about the Royal Guards themselves. Instead of seeing them as silent, ceremonial figures, viewers around the world began to understand them as highly trained, knowledgeable professionals who embodied centuries of military tradition and expertise. Back at the cafe, Madison was slowly beginning to process the full scope of what had happened and what it might mean for her future. "Danny," she said finally, "I think I need to really understand what just happened back there. That guard didn't just embarrass me, he taught me something." Danny looked up hopefully. "What do you mean?" Madison stared back toward the castle, where she could just make out the tiny figure of Harrison at his post. "I came here thinking I was so important, so special, that normal rules didn't apply to me. But he showed me that there are things bigger than social media, bigger than follower counts, bigger than my little world of sponsors and brand deals." She paused, struggling to articulate thoughts that were entirely new to her experience. When he talked about those traditions, about the history of that place, about the soldiers who died protecting those walls, I realized I don't actually know anything about the world I'm traveling through. I just see everything as background for my content. Danny nodded encouragingly. "So, what do you want to do about it?" Madison was quiet for a long moment, watching the steady stream of tourists entering and leaving the castle grounds. Many of them moved with a reverence and respect that she now recognized she had completely lacked. "I think," she said slowly, "I need to learn how to travel like a human being instead of like a content machine. I need to understand the places I visit, respect the people I meet, and maybe create content that actually means something." It was a radical transformation for someone who had built her career on superficial spectacle and manufactured controversy. But the encounter with Sergeant Harrison had shattered her assumptions about the world and her place in it. "Would you help me figure out how to do that?" she asked Danny. For the first time since he had started working for Madison, Danny smiled genuinely. "Yeah, I'd like that." As the afternoon wore on and the initial shock of her confrontation began to fade, Madison started to develop a plan. Instead of trying to salvage her damaged brand through defensive tactics or deflection, she would use this experience as an opportunity for genuine growth and change. Her first step would be a comprehensive apology video, not the kind of performative, strategic apology that influencers typically posted to manage PR disasters, but a genuine acknowledgement of her mistakes and a commitment to do better. She would research the history of Windsor Castle, the role of the Royal Guards, and the traditions she had so carelessly dismissed. She would learn about royal protocol, British military history, and the cultural significance of the institutions she had treated as props for her content. Most importantly, she would restructure her approach to travel content entirely. Instead of focusing on getting the most outrageous or boundary-pushing content possible, she would create educational material that helped her followers understand and respect the places they visited. It wouldn't be easy. Many of her current followers had been drawn to her brand specifically because of its irreverent, rules-don't-apply-to-me attitude. Some would undoubtedly abandon her if she moved toward more respectful, educational content. But as she sat outside Windsor Castle, still processing the most humbling experience of her life, Madison began to realize that the approval of people who encouraged disrespectful behavior might not be worth maintaining. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the morning's incident continued to spread far beyond Madison's personal crisis. The video of Harrison's response had been picked up by major news outlets, who praised his professionalism and used the incident to highlight the true role and qualifications of the Royal Guards. Military recruitment offices reported increased interest from young people who had been inspired by Harrison's demonstration of knowledge, discipline, and service. Tourism boards began incorporating the incident into their educational materials about respectful travel, using it as an example of why understanding local customs and laws was essential for international visitors. Educational institutions started using the video in courses about cultural sensitivity, international relations, and the importance of historical knowledge in understanding contemporary institutions. But perhaps most meaningfully, the incident had restored a measure of dignity and respect to the Royal Guards themselves. For too long, they had been seen primarily as tourist attractions, rather than as the highly qualified military professionals they actually were. Harrison's masterful handling of the situation, combining perfect military discipline with encyclopedic knowledge and unshakable composure, had reminded the world that the pageantry and ceremony of royal traditions were backed by substance, expertise, and genuine authority. As the sun began to set over Windsor Castle that evening, Sergeant Harrison completed his ceremonial duties and was relieved by the next shift. He returned to the guard quarters, where he was greeted by congratulations from his fellow soldiers and commendations from his superior officers. "Outstanding work today, Harrison," said his commanding officer. "The way you handled that situation exemplified everything the Royal Guards are supposed to represent." Harrison accepted the praise with characteristic modesty. "Just doing my job, sir. Following protocol and representing the Crown with dignity." But privately, he felt a deep satisfaction at having demonstrated that the traditions he served were not empty ceremony, but living embodiments of values worth defending: respect, knowledge, discipline, and service to something greater than oneself. As he prepared for the evening meal with his fellow guards, Harrison reflected on the morning's events. The young woman, Madison, had clearly learned something important from their encounter. He hoped she would use that lesson constructively, rather than simply as another story to tell for attention. More broadly, he was pleased that the incident had given him an opportunity to educate people about the true nature and importance of royal traditions. Too often, the guards were dismissed as anachronisms or tourist attractions. Today, he had been able to show that these traditions were backed by real knowledge, real expertise, and real commitment to serving the Crown and the nation. In the weeks that followed, Madison kept her word about changing her approach to content creation. Her apology video, posted 3 days after the Windsor Castle incident, was viewed millions of times and praised for its genuine introspection and commitment to growth. She spent the next month researching British history, royal protocol, and cultural sensitivity. She reached out to historians, military experts, and cultural education specialists to better understand the traditions she had dismissed so carelessly. When she finally returned to creating travel content, it was with a completely different approach. Instead of focusing on getting access to restricted areas or pushing boundaries for shock value, she created educational videos that helped her followers understand the historical and cultural significance of the places she visited. Her follower count initially dropped as some of her audience abandoned her for more controversy-focused creators, but it gradually began to grow again as she attracted viewers who were interested in respectful, educational travel content. More importantly, She began receiving messages from teachers, parents, and educational institutions who were using her videos as examples of how to travel respectfully and learn meaningfully from other cultures. Several of her former sponsors, who had initially distanced themselves from her brand after the Windsor Castle incident, reached out to discuss new partnerships focused on cultural education and responsible tourism. The transformation wasn't always easy. Madison had to confront years of entitled behavior and shallow thinking about the world around her. She had to learn how to find fulfillment in education and growth rather than in controversy and attention-seeking. But as she developed genuine expertise in history, culture, and respectful travel practices, she discovered a deeper satisfaction than she had ever found in her previous approach to content creation. 6 months after the Windsor Castle incident, Madison returned to London for a follow-up video about British royal traditions. This time, she approached Windsor Castle with careful preparation, extensive research, and deep respect for the institutions she was documenting. She maintained the proper distance from the guards, explained the historical significance of their role to her audience, and created content that enhanced rather than disrupted the experience of other visitors. As she filmed her respectful documentary-style content about royal protocol and military tradition, she caught sight of a familiar figure at one of the ceremonial positions. It was Sergeant Harrison, once again standing in perfect military stillness, once again embodying the centuries of tradition and service that she now understood and respected. She didn't approach him, didn't attempt to get his attention, and certainly didn't try to use him as a prop for her content. Instead, she simply included him in her wider shots as she explained to her audience the true significance of the Royal Guards and the important work they did. In the final segment of her video, filmed safely outside the castle grounds, Madison reflected on her personal journey from that embarrassing morning 6 months earlier. "I came to Windsor Castle thinking I was important enough that rules didn't apply to me," she told her audience. "I left understanding that some things are bigger than any of us individually: traditions, service, knowledge, respect. That guard taught me more in 10 minutes than I had learned in years of traveling the world for content." She looked back toward the ancient castle walls, where the guards continued their eternal watch. "The most powerful moment of that whole experience wasn't when I got embarrassed or corrected. It was when I realized that I had been living in this tiny bubble of social media and self-importance, completely disconnected from the real depth and meaning in the world around me." As she concluded her reflection, Madison felt genuinely grateful for the harsh lesson that had ultimately changed her life for the better. She had lost some followers, some sponsors, and some of her superficial confidence. But she had gained something far more valuable: genuine knowledge, real respect for other cultures, and a purpose beyond mere self-promotion. Back at Windsor Castle, Sergeant Harrison continued his duties, unaware of the profound impact his professional response had had on Madison's life. For him, the incident had been simply another day of serving the Crown with the dignity and expertise that his position demanded. But as he stood at his post, maintaining the perfect stillness and discipline that tourists often mistook for simplicity, Harrison embodied something that Madison now understood and respected: the idea that true strength comes not from demanding attention or breaking rules, but from knowledge, service, and commitment to principles greater than oneself. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had witnessed countless confrontations over the centuries: battles, sieges, political upheavals, and personal dramas. But perhaps few had been resolved with such a perfect demonstration of how knowledge, discipline, and dignity could triumph over ignorance, entitlement, and disrespect. As the sun set over the Thames Valley, casting long shadows across the castle courtyard, the Royal Guards maintained their watch as they had for generations, as they would for generations to come. They stood as living symbols of service, tradition, and the idea that some things in the world deserved protection and respect, regardless of changing fashions in fame, attention, or social media influence. The morning's confrontation had ended not with violence or lengthy legal proceedings, but with education, growth, and mutual respect. It was, in its own way, a perfect example of how the best of British traditions, knowledge, fairness, dignity, and service, could meet the challenges of the modern world and emerge stronger than before. What are your thoughts about this clash between social media entitlement and traditional military discipline? Share your opinions in the comments below. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel